And good morning. Welcome in. ESPN 1059 The Zone. We are the Out of Bounds Show. We're driven by your next Ford F-150 truck. Mack Hike Ford, I-55 North in Jackson. Number one Ford dealership and the largest in the state of Mississippi. Mack Hike Ford for your next pre-owned or new F-150 truck. Our guests join us on the Farm Bureau Insurance Guest Line. We welcome in the Paul Finebaum from the Paul Finebaum Show on the SEC Network. Paul, good morning. It's been a while.
Bo, it's my pleasure. I'm really thrilled to be back with you.
Well, I appreciate your time. Several years ago, you and I had dinner at Shula's Steakhouse in Birmingham during SEC Media Days, and you told me the story about, hey, look, I had a great show in Alabama, statewide. We were rolling, two most passionate fan bases in all of college football. And then Nick Saban shows up and starts winning, and our ratings quadruple. And then the SEC Network comes calling. Now, I think you played it down that you put yourself in position, longtime print journalist. You had made the transition to sports talk radio, so on. But in your wildest dreams, did you ever think that all this would happen for the University of Alabama, even though he had been successful for that 5-year run at LSU, now that we look at what Saban accomplished in Tuscaloosa, Paul?
No, Bo, because the hardest thing to understand was that he would be there for a while, because I'll never forget when he got the job. Everybody in the industry, on ESPN, on every other show, from Jim Rome to Colin Cowherd to Dan Lebitard to Dan Patrick, all the people that really mattered at that moment, said that he was a fraud, he was a liar. This was all because he left, because he originally said he wasn't leaving Alabama. He wasn't leaving Miami for Alabama, and then he did leave 3 weeks later. And I made the mistake on the day he was hired on a local TV show predicting he'd win a national championship in 4 years, and the host literally laughed me off the set, and I thought I was wrong. He won 1 in 3. So, I mean, I thought he would win. I didn't think he would stay there for 17 years and literally change everyone's life. And you mentioned me. Quick aside, I was doing a show following Rush Limbaugh on an AM news talk station in 2006, and my contract was up, and I was offered by the sports station, and all my team did not want to go, because at the time sports radio was not what it is today. But they were moving to an FM signal. Can you imagine? That wasn't that long ago, and all of us were on AM. We made the move, and Saban arrived 2 weeks later, I think. Within a year, our ratings had quadrupled. And Bo, for whatever you want to say about me, the reason the ratings quadrupled was because of Nick Saban, not me.
When I know you had conversations with the late Mal Moore, and the search at that time looked like it was in disarray, Paul, because the whole Rich Rod thing, and there were some other guys in the mix, and Mal Moore went down there, and Saban, like you said, I'm not leaving. And then I had heard maybe Mal Moore talk to a very influential, prominent booster, and the guy told Mal, look, you need to get back on a plane and go back there and sell and recruit and so on. Did Mal Moore ever share the story of what happened, I guess, the second time he went down there to convince Terry and Nick to come back to Tuscaloosa, Paul?
He did it. The funny thing was, Saban originally said no, and they offered the job to Rich Rodriguez, who was at West Virginia doing very well. And you've probably heard this story before, but some guy calls our show on Thursday night and just trashes Rodriguez, especially his wife, Rita. Now, a smart host would have cut the guy off, but you know me. And by the time the story got back to West Virginia, Rodriguez heard the story that I had trashed his wife and said a bunch of things I'm not going to repeat. When he turned the job down on Friday, the first call we had was a guy blaming me for costing Alabama Rich Rodriguez. So the story stuck that because of something I said, Rodriguez turned the job down, and they ended up with Saban. And by the way, I am never going to correct that urban legend. But back to your question, after that, Steve Spurrier got in the mix. And I happened to be in the middle of it because a friend of Mal's asked me to contact Spurrier indirectly, so there was no trail. He considered taking it, and he didn't. I'll never forget Jimmy Sexton calling me one day and saying, "No, I will not use the language Jimmy used, but he said nobody wants that blanking job." It was that bad. And then 2 weeks later, Saban was introduced, and of course Jimmy was on the front row. But it was, beyond, essentially, you've heard the story, but it's true that Terry Saban told Mal Moore not to leave Fort Lauderdale. So he hung around for 2 days, and then Saban finally changed his mind.
We're visiting with Paul Finebaum on the Farm Bureau Insurance guest line, talking about the how Saban got to Tuscaloosa and the magical run. How close or how seriously do you believe Spurrier considered taking the job at that time, Paul?
He considered it very seriously. The issue was, I think his daughter had just moved to Columbia, and she was pregnant with, I think, his first grandchild. He couldn't do it. And what's interesting is I reminded him. I said, Steve, you could have had another job years ago if you'd been patient. And I think it was the previous year, or it may have been 2 years earlier. He was up for the LSU job.
Yes.
And he could not wait. That was when Saban left, ironically. But when South Carolina called, he just said yes. He had been out of coaching for a year. Had he waited a couple of weeks, he would have gone to LSU and maybe had the kind of run that Saban did at Alabama. Those are just little, nuggets that you sit around on a Friday afternoon at a bar going, what if? But that might be one of the great what ifs of all time.
Okay, Nick Saban. You've had access throughout this run, and it's been magical for all of us. Were you tipped off that this was going down, Paul?
Not directly, but indirectly. Bo, it's something I've been wrong about Saban for a couple of years. I've watched him. I've kept thinking at some point he's going to win a championship and bail out. And I can't tell you how many essays I've written for SportsCenter on Nick Saban's career in the event that he retired 10 minutes after a national championship. And by the way, I wrote a couple this year too, in December, just in case. So I was watching it very closely, but I received a call the day after the SEC championship game from one of Saban's assistant coaches. This isn't, somebody near the program. This is somebody on the staff, on the field, okay? And he called me about 5 o'clock on that Sunday, and he said, I think this is it. I said, what do you mean? He goes, beating Kirby, stopping that three-peat was really important to Nick.
Wow.
He said, everybody thinks it's about the national championship, but that was in his head, the fact that his own pupil, and his star pupil, by the way, and they're close, was about to pretty much knock Nick Saban out of the king's chair. And from that moment on, I was locked in. And even in Pasadena, I brought it up once or twice. Here's the funny thing. The day after not the day after the game, but the Wednesday after the Monday Rose Bowl, I was on Get Up with Greenberg. And he said, do you think this was it, Paul? Is this the last time? And I said, I kept saying to myself, don't say it. I don't want to make headlines in the event that he stays. But I couldn't help myself at the very end. I said, Greeny, I said, it's very likely that was the last time we'll ever see Nick Saban. And all of a sudden, I went off the set. I went off the show, and on my Twitter feed, Stephen A. Smith was calling me out saying, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. There's no way Nick Saban. And he had me on the show the next day. And by then I said, you know what? I don't really – I mean, you understand this. Sometimes with a guy like Saban, it's just not worth fighting.
Right.
So I just said, well, I don't know. And of course, the next. So I'm not trying to tell you I knew anything, but I sensed it, but I was maybe hoping it wasn't true, but I felt like there was a reasonably good chance it was.
Okay, when the assistant coach called you on the Sunday after Saban beat Smart, and that makes sense how bad he wanted to win that game to go out, kind of make things right in his mind, I guess. When he did call you, you probably weren't that surprised or shocked, right? That this thing could go down.
No, you can figure out who it is, but it's somebody that would understand what Nick Saban was going through. And he told me they had been on a recruiting trip, Bo, the previous week. And Saban just looked at him and said, "Man, I'm getting tired. This is just too much." And what he meant by that wasn't physically, because Nick Saban could still outrun both of us. It was just having to deal with everything that we talk about every day. And yeah, it's coming out now, and it will come out more that going to the game, coming out of the game in Pasadena, players were trying to heist Saban for more money, coming and going. And I think he finally just said enough of it.
Right.
And it's easy to come to that conclusion, but I think he knew that he stole a season this year. Alabama had no business playing in the semifinals. I mean, they really. I mean, Milroe was. I mean, he did bench Jalen Milroe. Let's not forget that. And every Alabama fan now believes that was all by design. It was not by design. He had an offensive coordinator that wanted his own guy in there, and not Jalen Milroe.
Okay. Here's where I'm so impressed with him, Paul. And again, you know him, and I'm jealous of that because we've covered him, and he's fascinating, and he's so bright and successful, and so on. So Coach K steps down, and Krzyzewski, quite frankly, makes it all about him for 6 months. Every arena or gym they go to, and that's fine. Coach K's a legend too. What's so impressive to me, Paul, is this guy. He could have made it a much bigger ordeal. He just decides, I'm retiring. They call a very quick press conference, and then he goes about his life. Now, the spotlight will be around him, and we'll get into the media stuff in a minute, but I don't want to say how impressed you were, but I guess, did it surprise you at all the way he went about it, Paul?
That's who he is. And remember, this is a coach that's been at the epicenter of the sport for 17 years and longer, really. I just don't think he could deal with that. I think he finally came to grips with his age and his place. But
hold on, Paul, real quick. Do you know how impressive that is for a man that accomplished to come to grips with that?
No. The number of people that have done it this way, you can write on one finger probably. John Wooden might be the only one. He announced 2 days before his final game that he was retiring, and but no, nobody. I mean, the number of horrible farewells we have both collectively seen is frightening. This was at or near the top.
You've been able to see. When did you start writing it in the state of Alabama, Paul?
I came in 1980. I covered the last 3 years of Coach Bryant. First big game I ever covered, I was in Jackson, Mississippi. I saw
6-3.
6-3. I'll never forget it. I was on the sidelines watching Mal Moore fail to get a play in on the goal line.
Wow. I was there. I was 7 years old, and John Bond became a god for me in the state of Mississippi that day. And I remember because the Bear would always come into Veterans Memorial Stadium, and I grew up here in Jackson, and you could get season tickets to all three teams in Veterans Memorial, Paul, both Mississippi State, Ole Miss, and Southern Miss. And the Bear, you felt like the Bear was there all the time, and he would lean on the goalpost in the end zone pregame, and you really felt like, Jesus had walked into the stadium. I mean, it was
close.
Okay. So you did it all. You went from the Bear to Ray Perkins to they finally hit on Stallings. Then they went way out into no man's land over multiple coaches, and then they get Saban. Here's what's crazy to me, Paul, is that the overwhelming majority of the time when you replace a legend, you can't win in collegiate athletics. I actually think Byrne nailed the hire, and if anybody can follow Saban, he's not going to rip off as many championships as you and I know, but Kalen DeBoer is a dude, Paul, and if anybody can pull this off, I think it's him. What do you think?
He's capable because he's got the personality, and everyone else that usually follows a legend, and I lived it in Alabama after Bryant, tried to do everything different DeBoer so far has done just about everything. I mean, first of all, he doesn't really seem to have an ego. He comes off a little mundane or boring, which I think is the best way to do it.
Sure.
So I think it's possible. The problem is the playoff complicates everything. And the one thing I don't know, the first time his daughters or wife, and I'll try not to be too self-serving here, puts on the Paul Finebaum show after a loss, I think that's going to be a shock.
I agree. I think you just nailed it, because someone close to Dennis Franchione told me, and Dennis actually won and left on his own regard to go to A&M, which is unheard of at a program like Alabama. But someone close to that program said that his wife couldn't handle them going to dinner and people would know what kind of salad dressing she was eating, Paul. It's just a different deal, as you know. Yeah,
no, it is, and that's I think DeBoer can handle it, but the family really does matter. And listen, you've covered plenty of thin-skinned coaches. I'm thinking of one that's still coaching in the SEC. That they know, the family knows everything because the coaches usually know everything. But other than that, I think the table's pretty well set.
Paul Finebaum on the Farm Bureau Insurance Guest Line. Can you share a conversation that you and Saban had? And this may have been 7 to 8 years in, when y'all got to know each other, and maybe he could drop his, I'm talking about off the air, drop his guard a little bit, and y'all had a conversation about something other than football, Paul, like family or something else?
Yeah, I'll tell you something funny. One day I was there. I mean, ESPN affords you some opportunities that I didn't have previously in my print life. So I spent, I did a profile of him, which meant I traveled with him a lot. I traveled with him one weekend. But anyway, we got back to Tuscaloosa, and we were at his camp one day in the summer, so he was relaxed. And he, as the camp was ending, we went into his office, and he said, "I got to tell you something." He said, "Don't tell anybody." I mean, I thought, man, I'm about to get a major scoop here. He goes, "I'm going to see the Stones tonight in Atlanta." And he started talking about music. And this conversation, Bo, went on 30 or 40 minutes. And then he proceeded to tell me that after every game, he and Terry get in the car and they put on "Gimme Shelter." And then his favorite record of all time is some Eagles Live in Tokyo. And he started going through all the songs. And I mean, it was truly, and he told me about meeting John Mellencamp once and going to a Springsteen concert with Bill Belichick. And I mean, to me, that was fascinating because it was so unlike anything I'd ever heard from Nick Saban.
Okay. That is a great story that you had that he shared all this, here's who I love to listen to and music experiences with you during his coaching career. Okay. As we wrap it up, what do you think this looks like the next couple? Look, Kirby Smart's big time. They're going to win another, who knows how many more, but there's a shift. There's a paradigm shift, Paul. And while we have good coaches, Kirby, Brian Kelly, Kiffin, and I think there's going to be some there's going to be some others emerge. How do you think it's going to be different? What do you think it's going to look like, Paul?
Well, I mean, it's already different because when I interview people every day from Alabama, it's more about Saban than it is DeBoer. And I don't think that's going to end. But I think it is going to be different because even Kirby Smart on his best day, Bo, he doesn't have the gravitas that Nick Saban did. And I feel very fortunate. Very few people can ever cover two guys at the bookends of their career who are considered the greatest coach in college football history.
True.
But it was like that. I mean, when you saw Paul Bryant walk on the field, I mean, you couldn't take your eyes off of him. He's one of the most intimidating people I've ever seen. Saban was similar. I mean, Kirby doesn't have that. I mean, Brian Kelly is a very impressive guy. I like him immensely. Kiffin's a character, but none of these people are in the league of Nick Saban. So I think that's going to be the biggest change, the star factor.
Well, you're a blessed man. You got to cover Coach Paul Bear Bryant, Nick Saban, and Kirby Smart, among others. But that's and have relationships with them. That's pretty damn impressive. Paul Finebaum, thanks for your time today. We appreciate it. I hope to see you soon.
Well, the pleasure was mine. Hope to see you very, very soon. All the best.
Thanks, Paul. Paul Finebaum on the Farm Bureau Insurance Guest Line, the Paul Finebaum Show on the SEC Network. He started in 1980 covering Coach Paul Bear Bryant. I was at that game, Bama, Mississippi State. It is one of the most famous games played by one of our teams in the state of Mississippi, and they've had some big ones. And that was 6-3, where that Mississippi State defense was so unbelievable. That Bama was on a 28 game winning streak. Back-to-back national champs, and going into that game, they were supposed to win a third. Again, Vince Dooley owes Coach Paul Bear Bryant, he owed him Christmas dinner, Thanksgiving dinner, 4th of July vacations, because by Mississippi State beating Alabama and ending the 28-game winning streak out here, Veterans Memorial Stadium, it allowed Georgia and Herschel Walker and Vince Dooley to win the national championship. And they were the only team in the 80s, and it was in 1980, to win the national championship, if you can believe. Jason can't wrap his brain around that. The SEC did not win another national championship in the 80s after 1980, when Georgia won it because Bama lost to Mississippi State.
Wow. And the fact that Paul was at that game too, and you were at that game?
I know.
I
didn't even know who Paul was.
That's crazy. Well, I mean,
obviously you didn't know who I was.
Yeah.
But, I would know who Paul was just a few years later, because he was a huge writer in the state of Alabama, out of Birmingham. Mm-hmm. And that's when we got all of our news through newspaper. And I remember going to SEC basketball tournaments and seeing Paul's, you have your little shot.
Oh, right. The headshot, everything.
Headshot.
Yeah.
Right. He'd be writing on Wimp Sanderson or Barkley, or, and I devoured it as a kid. I'd go down to the lobby in Birmingham and just, I got to read about Wimp Sanderson. I thought what Wimp was doing was amazing. And I thought, I've told you this, Charles Barkley's arguably my favorite player of all time. It'd be tough, though. I think it is. Chris Jackson, Charles Barkley. I tell you what, I'll pour a Wilderness Trail bourbon late this afternoon, and I'll think on it.
Ooh.
I'll be in debation, like a guy I knew said in college.
I like that.
He was in debation on where he was going to go for happy hour. And so that's what I'll do. This show, I feel like we started the show 5 minutes ago.
Me
Some
too.
shows feel like a grind. You feel like you're doing 6 hours. This show felt like 15 minutes. Very weird. Tonight's game, Mississippi State A&M. I don't have to tell you. You already know. It's a big one. 8 o'clock tip. So we'll see. Jans and the Dogs need it. And it's a winnable game, but A&M is a 2.5-point favorite. A&M's not great, but they're not a bad basketball team. It's on ESPNU. Good hell. All right. I'm your host, Bo Bounds. Jason was here today. We had a good show. I thought our SEC Insider Hit at 7:30 was nothing short of epic sports talk radio. We would love for you to go to Apple Podcast or Spotify and listen to our interviews, like the Tom Luganbill and Paul Finebaum interview, or our nonsense from the 7:30 segment. Search Out of Bounds with Bo Bounds. We're on Spotify. See ya.